William James, for example, talks about the cash value of an idea. And he says, don't worry about the absolute truth of an idea. Worry about, do you get a better life out of it? Does it grow fruit or not? And which is sort of an interesting, we talked about fruitfulness, and it didn't seem radical at the time to talk about fruitfulness. But when you put it philosophically in this setting, it's actually pretty radical. And don't worry about truth, worry about fruit. Like what fruits out, that's your truth, right? That's your cash values.
I've been thinking about that phrase, like, um, that all paths, meaning all spiritual paths, lead to the same place. I think you have a more pithy way of saying it, like all roads lead to the top of the mountain, or Rome, or something, something like that. And I'm wondering about, like, like, there are some big differences between those paths. And I'm wondering what differences might be more or less important. And is the destination really the same? And so one, for example, that I'm thinking of is, and I really don't know how this is treated across different paths, but the idea of non-attachment compared to um, squeezing all the juice out of life. And we've talked about that dichotomy in terms of living with passion and living without passion and balancing those two.
Mhm.
But I'm curious about how, um, like, what are some big differences between practices? And I can even see them emphasizing polar opposites, but still aiming to arrive at the same place. And is it really the same place? I guess that's
Mhm.
something I'm curious about.
Well, my impulse is to say that if we're talking really about spiritual traditions, that while it's all well and good to say that they all meet at the top, at the same time we have to recognize that regardless of the tradition we're talking about, very, very, very few of the adherents make it to the top. I would say that most end their lifetimes before they attain the top, or they get caught on the side paths. And I suppose that if everybody made it to the top, the differences in the paths would not be as relevant as they seem to be, given that most people stop verdantly or inadvertently somewhere along the way, you know. And I think Rabbi Schlachter had the same mountain analogy that everybody's trying to get to this top, and we didn't really address whether it was an attainable top or not. Uh, the the relative unattainability of it within the time span of one lifetime is actually, for me, one of the better arguments for reincarnation, is that this seems like a pretty long curriculum, and that there's and I guess this is going to trace back to, whether you're a materialist or an idealist. Um, but I guess there's, when I look for different paths, I look within these different traditions. For example, I think one of the biggest distinctions in paths is probably between the head and the heart, which would show up in the yogas as jnana yoga, jnana yoga, as knowledge, the path of knowledge, and then bhakti yoga is the path of devotion. And so, for example, when I look at certain people's, certain more traditional Christians' relationships with saints, say within Catholicism, what I see there looks like very much like a devotional practice, like a bhakti yoga.
You mean the devotion that the saints exhibit or the way the people you know relate to the saints?
The way people relate to it.
Got it.
In other words, there's a real heart centric approach that's different than the strictly mental approach. And and then there's this other path that I have found significant, which is karma, the path of karma yoga. And it sort of says that you're wanting to see all the events that unfold in your lifetime as a path, and that you're not making that rigid distinction between on the path and just as a householder. That there is a path as a householder, which is to say as a more or less normal person. Uh, and then there's also the path that we refer to as uh, uh, yoga, hatha yoga, which is through the physical vessel, which we spoke about in our episode about the physicality of spirituality. And I think that there is a component to all of these things that is probably necessary in some respect. That while they're presented as maybe mutually exclusive, maybe one is primary, but they certainly harmonize. Um, I mean, as far as those paths, uh, yeah, I mean, I guess they are there. The farther you get along, I think it is true that the less difference there is because of the nature. The closer you're getting to the point of these, the presumably the more stuff you've worked through. So as you come closer, regardless of which side the mountain you're climbing up, once you've climbed halfway up, your view is still definitely better than before you did. Um, and uh, what's the rock and roll reference to go along with that? Fearless by Pink Floyd. Right. Uh, and you pick the place and I'll choose the time or something like.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I'll climb that hill in my own way. And that's another interesting thing that I was thinking about in relation to here's a random association. Okay, you've got the Knights of the Round Table, and they find out about the Holy Grail. I can't remember who was talking about this. And the notion is that this being, of course, a foundational myth of the Western traditions. When they find out about the Holy Grail, they decide to set out to find the Holy Grail. But they don't set out together. They set out each on their own quest. And I'll climb that hill in my own way, which is different than, say, the Eastern tradition where one sees oneself as supported by the Sangha, the congregation, and by the lineage and by the guru, where there are all these. The Western idea is a lot more just, you're out there on your own. And there's something about, this is the camel setting out into the desert that we've spoken about from Nietzsche's Prolegomena and Zarathustra, and this idea that there is some aloneness there with the desert, implied by the desert. And yeah, and again, I'm tangled still up in the middle of being in time with Heidegger, and so I'm in the section now where he talks about a relationship with others. And this sort of it does shine some illuminates to some degree our relationship, what he would call being with others, hyphenated all one, that it is within the nature of our humanity to be with others. And that even when we're not proximally, spatially with others, we're still in a state of being with others. It just might be a deficient state. It's a way to think about it. But what he does, what he gets into when you really delve into it is sort of a tyranny of the they that he refers to as das Man, but it has to do with the the fact that the world at large is produced by the mass of humanity immersed in inauthenticity, focused on small b being, which is to say things, instead of the capital B being, which is to say, what is it fundamentally to be alive and to be human? And to realize that through the picture frame of birth and death and I guess you could say the frames in the other dimensions would be the pragmatic limitations of human experience as we travel through life. And so somehow those are like the dimensions of our human experience. But we lead ourselves away. When I was thinking about this the other day, when you get to be my age, you start to see people dying around you. And we mentioned a number of episodes ago, I talked about a fellow in our neighborhood here, who I had lunch with. I had lunch with him and another fellow, and then 2 weeks later, he passed. Well, in the intervening time, a couple other.
I might not know about this. Maybe tell me offline, which of our neighbors passed away.
Oh, this was Michael T. We talked about it on the show.
Oh, I thought you said a couple weeks ago, but those 2 incidents were a couple weeks apart. Got it.
Right, I had
Okay.
lunch with him, and then a couple weeks later, boom, he was gone. And we mutually had lunch with a third guy who was another Vietnam vet who now has since passed in the intervening year, say, since we had lunch, since we all had lunch. And also in that time was another person who knew, and I think we also mentioned because I had a dream related to his passing. And this was somebody that actually had a PhD in philosophy, curiously enough. And, he was at a ripe old age and had a, fulfilling life, in many dimensions. Uh, Whereas the two guys that I had lunch with, they both were Vietnam vets. And the reason that I'm juxtaposing them is because of this Heideggerian idea of our lives being framed by death, that we conceive of our life as a narrative, and that that narratives necessarily have a closing chapter, right? There is no never-ending story, really. And so uh, I was musing about that because when I looked at the fellow with the PhD, wonderful, positive dude. Uh, he seemed to not get the immediacy of death. You got the feeling that he thought he was going to be back in a few months, like you get over the flu. And
Meaning he believed in reincarnation, or he just wasn't connected to mortality?
he just wasn't connected to the reality of mortality.
Okay.
And he also
How old was he?
he was in the same generation, maybe a little bit older than these other two guys that I'm talking about,
Huh, okay.
but he was not a Vietnam vet. And I believe that one of these guys that I had lunch with, who was a vet, I believe he was one of the guys that worked in the tunnels. And, just as I was musing about all three of these guys, I couldn't help but get kind of a meter reading about their relationship with temporality in that Heideggerian sense. And I can't help but feel that without them having the PhD in philosophy, but having been to Vietnam and really seen the reality of death all around them, somehow they seem to me less attached, more realizing that, they knew they didn't have long and they weren't being hyper dramatic about it. In fact, if anything, the opposite. There was an acceptance there. You didn't get the feeling that there was, any kind of a personal project to try to avoid realizing that, like they had come to that realization long ago and had made some sort of peace with it. And, this again sort of is just underlining that this is the reason I guess we came upon this is because this is one of the elements that causes the cultivation of philosophy that is an ultimate alone experience. And that as our ceremonies, even though there's someone there to be there with you, there is an aloneness that is unlike maybe the aloneness in our normal everyday experience.
Well, it's funny. There are a couple things there that I want to dig into a little more, but I was just thinking about ceremonies. So let's start there because as far as spiritual practices go, I would say ceremonies are, as far as I can tell, kind of a different animal because there's this um oh, I don't even know how to c- because it's both like, okay, so you're learning how to hang out in a trance state and you're learning how to stay connected with yourself under tremendous duress and all of those things can relate to meditative practices. And you're learning to be the kind of you're learning self mastery um, on any number of levels. The one I think of as kind of a peak. It was a peak experience, but one I could go back to over and over was getting the thinking out of the way and just exercising acting, and that there's a expression of the true self that can be accessed that way, or of a relatively true self, if you will. And so there's a spiritual practice to that. But you're but there's no indication that the people who do a lot of ceremonies are necessarily more spiritually enlightened, right? They might have some arrows in their quiver, but they're not necessarily firing them in a useful direction. So I mean, to some extent, that's true with any practice. But maybe let me ask you: do you think ceremonies are a spiritual practice, something else, or both?
I think that they are not technically what I would call a spiritual practice. What they do is they break the mold of somebody's materialistic worldview in a way that lets some light in that may have thunderous enough ramifications for them in their reassessment, maybe of being metaphysically what it is to be them, that it might have some form of spiritual ramifications. But I make a distinction, and I'm probably got this from somewhere, but I can't tell you where. We have this normal consciousness, and everybody's might be a little different, but uh, it's sort of like living in the suburbs. you kind of have familiar places and your worlds have a lot of overlap. But once you decide that you're going to set out to leave that known neighborhood of consciousness, it's not a given that there's just only one other place that you can go. Turns out there's a lot of other places you can go. And that those different places have certain differing characteristics and differing impacts. And so uh, I make a big distinction, and this is the distinction that I don't know where exactly I got this from, but it's the distinction between magic and theogeny. And ceremonies I would put into the realm of magic as opposed to theogeny. Theogeny meaning I'm going to go see God, and magic meaning I want, I don't, here I am in consciousness dangling between matter and super consciousness. There's a lot of different directions maybe within both of those directions, but those are the fundamental. Do I go farther away from matter and more into the ideal realms, the so-called spiritual realms, where I may well see what Lao Tzu calls the source of life if I'm doing things right, or if I paid the price maybe, or am I trying to dick around with stuff? Now, I make that sound trivial, but that's because I'm comparing with the realization of the cosmic source of everything. But, healing, when you want to work on a patient's body or work about anything to do with, your life and the here and now and material, working out all that stuff about being a human, that's not theogony. That has more to do with magic. And that's why it can be dangerous. That's why there are cautions that have to go along with that, because it's kind of like opening up the back of the TV set. And yeah, you can get some interesting effects, but you can also shock yourself pretty bad if you don't know what you're doing, which is why, you know, lineages are our friend in that situation. This is a case where I say, no, follow the lineage. You don't want to climb the mountain your own way.
I just want to pick at that a little bit because the
Mhm.
the working out all of the details about your life and how do I live a better life and all of that stuff, I guess strike me as the same kind of realizations or work that you might do as you're in a meditative practice. I mean, I, I think I've had the same kinds of insights meditating. Um, so I maybe you can put a finer point on the distinction between like maybe it's really about the definition of magic that could use maybe more clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's using mind on matter and through will, through intent, and that's different uh, it's doing something fundamentally different in your nervous system. And just because you can do magic doesn't mean you're going to be able to generate the type of forces that theogony require. And the same is the case when we talked about internal arts. And I said I don't think people get to that level very often. It's because I don't know that that's what they're about. This is more about I'm going to generate this internal energy, not to go to visit God, but to actually deal with, you know, uh, a material situation, and it has similar dangers, right? I can I can get this physical mastery and go become a tyrant, a monster. I could become a. You remember I was talking about that one magic book, this old magic book, and in the beginning the guy who's translating it or who wrote it down says only 3 people in history have mastered this book. One went insane and committed suicide. The other went insane and committed ravages, and I am the third. He says, which you kind of scooch away from him on the bench after that, I guess. But so, so this is the higher up the mountain, the harder the wind blows, right? And so, uh, with great power is great responsibility, all of that kind of stuff. But but I think there are two fundamentally different ideas, and that the the danger of one is that you start to serve ego, right? And that's when matter starts to dominate spirit and mind. And this is when Heidegger says we're too focused in the small b being, which is to say things, and we need to be focused on the capital B being, which is to say what it is to be human and what is the fulfillment of human, spirit, and and to be in the world. But I think in the same way, we've said before, and I think some great sages we've probably quoted saying this idea that when you go to find God, you typically find yourself first. And so there is a lot of working out of stuff on the level of self to kind of get certain things out of the way before you've dropped enough ballast maybe to get to the places where you're more likely to see God per se. And and I want to put that "see God" in quotes. One of the things that I think is interesting again about Heidegger is that he's trying to get us to realize that our most authentic expression in life is going to be if we're in contact with this capital B being that we're going to come in contact with through not just encountering death or the idea of death or our finality, but through an introspective channel, through an understanding, a plumbing of our own consciousness. Plumbing, I mean reaching into the depths. I don't mean check valves. Yeah. And so, um, but he was trained by Jesuits, and there's a good argument that says, and I'm not making it, but there are those that do, that he was smuggling God in the back door, saying, you have your, and I think there's something fair about that. I think that he's trying to present this ontologically, which is to say philosophically, which is to say ontologically means to understand the nature of being, and philosophically to be wise about life, and that experience of the deepest nature of reality doesn't have to come dressed up as a sectarian religion. It's an experience first and foremost, and then we decide to dress it up with language. And one of the reasons that philosophers, and Heidegger is great for this, they build an entire language, and you have to learn what they mean when they use this word. And sometimes they've got what we call neologisms. They built words because you don't have a word for what they're trying to point to. And then they're going to build this whole structure out of it, and they're doing this all to point to something. But they know that to point to that thing, they have to build this context within which the pointing happens. And the purpose of that is to take you out of the context that your thinking already lives in, and to put you in this context that they've constructed to illuminate. They've set up the raking light, if you will, the philosophical raking light to reveal the topographies that they want to show, that often are lost in the flatness of the way we typically see things, right? Raking light is something that an artist will use, or particularly an art restorer might use, which is light from the side that shows the actual topography of the surface. So if a painter paints with a thick impasto, which is to say he is making the paint sellers happy because he's really glomming it on there thick so it's sticking off the canvas. And there are painters that really push the envelope on that, right? Well, if you light that from a certain side, you're going to see a whole texture to it that you won't see if you light it from above or from behind you or from, you know. So so the idea is that a philosopher will set up through language a context that sets up the light, so to speak, in a way that shows the relief of certain things that they see are important. And in this case, it's Heidegger trying to point to us, how do you live? You know, philosophers, they really are trying to get us to the richest life. That's what philosophy is, what being wise is right, getting to the richest understanding and living and experience of life. And that means that they're not chefs. They're not trying to do it through gastronomic ecstasy. They're not artists. They're not trying to paint something that engages our eyes, right? They're not, uh, you know, what are the other dimensions? They're not massage therapists trying to kinesthetically please us. They're not uh, musicians trying to orally please us. They're actually trying to speak to our faculty of understanding in a way that transforms all of those things and everything else that happens in life. And so they're really reaching for the biggest multiplier that will apply to everything. And that's why I would say that, you know, in a lot of ways, if you're really getting some wood on the ball, philosophy is your best bang for buck in lived experience, in your Heideggerian's term, your Lebenswelt. This made it into psychology, your living world, your lived experience, straight out of Heidegger, right? So, so, uh, so yeah, I mean, that's these different methods. That's what they're all trying to do somehow. They're all trying to be to be multipliers that enhance the quality of our lived experience. And understanding turns out to be the means, the bridge for that. And that's why language gets so important. And that's why how we talk about things is so important, and why it can be a revealer of things in the way we use it. So, you know, all of these are ways to experience, and whether the top of the mountain is God or the top of the mountain is the nature of existence, right? Those are the guys that gave us, who we've been talking about, all these guys, they gave us existentialism, right? So it came right out of that. Without these guys, no Camus, no Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, none of those guys, right? And uh, so yeah, I mean, and then there's what Schopenhauer warns us of with the sleepwalking, or Heidegger warns us of, this world of inauthenticity, and getting back to this idea that our relationship with others has to do with whether we see others as supporting us, like the Buddhist model. Well, there's the Sangha, and there's the gurus, and there's you know, all the Dharma. This is all others that have helped us. We've talked about that, trusting others as a main method. And then there's the West's idea that says, you know, Voltaire, hell is other people, and that really or, you know, Heidegger saying that the they of society erases us. It completely obstructs and obscures our relationship with our own capital B being. And so that we have to find a process, a way to uncover ourselves, uh, so that we can find a way to authenticity. And that's going to be the way to this richer experience, you know. But
It reminds me of the dependence, independence, interdependence continuum too, because it seems like Western philosophers came around to wanting to find the infinite in the other and merging of horizons and realizing that dialogue and um, connection with others uh, furthers, right? And gives us access to not only expanding our consciousness and understanding, but also potentially our compassion and our, softer faculties, if you will. And I guess I'm sure it's not a paradox, but it keeps showing up to me as one. Like the specter of death makes it very clear to us that there's an aloneness to this process of living. And we have to go out in the desert alone and we have to master ourselves. And that's a individual process. And we have to die alone. But yet we also talk about our consciousness merging with others. And we talk about being a whole and a part. Being a holon, we're also part of a field of humanity, and we can't escape that. Um, so I don't know what there is to say about that, but I guess I'm assuming that different spiritual paths treat that differently. And maybe a question to ask about that is, you mentioned earlier when you're halfway up the mountain, obviously you're in a different place from where you started, and as you get closer to the top, um, you end up having uh, developing similar understandings regardless of the path you took. But I don't know if when you get halfway up, the remaining half might be stuff that was in the first half of a different path. I know that's too literal of a way of thinking about it, but
Mhm, mhm.
like, are there a way that these blocks stack in a predictable way, or can you really build the structure with completely different blocks, you know?
Yeah, I would have to guess that in in addressing that particular function, I would think it has a lot to do with the nervous system and the way the nervous system is structured, so that there would be some diversity, but a lot of following the path that the nervous system requires to unfold. But what I thought was interesting, you made a comment that about Western philosophy and Western philosophy coming upon dialogue, but what was interesting there is that starting 100 years ago, a little more than that, we got this fracture in Western philosophy that we've talked about a little bit, and it was the fracture between continental philosophy happening, on the continent, which is to say European philosophy, and American philosophy. And the the American philosophy turned to okay, the one school that I think it will behoove us to unfold. We've touched on a few times, but I think we'll unfold more in the future here. It comes out of William James, and the school is called pragmatism. And Americans in general are identified as being of a pragmatic bent, we might say. Well, pragmatic comes from the Greek word pragmata, which means things, basically. And that is an indication of an outward directedness. So William James, for example, talks about the cash value of an idea. And he says, don't worry about the absolute truth of an idea. Worry about, do you get a better life out of it? Does it grow fruit or not? And which is sort of an interesting, we talked about fruitfulness, and it didn't seem radical at the time to talk about fruitfulness. But when you put it philosophically in this setting, it's actually pretty radical. And don't worry about truth, worry about fruit. Like what fruits out, that's your truth, right? That's your cash values. So, but at the same time, we had, starting with Husserl, influenced by William James, we had this drive towards interiority. We can't understand anything that we see through the telescope or the microscope unless we understand the telescope and the microscope, which in this case is to say the self. So
And
you
fruit. I mean, you can't be. you can't be fruitful without putting some real thought into what's worth, like what counts as fruit, and how do you know it when you see it?
And that's tangled up with your fruit is to go back to Heidegger. In this case, I would say fruit is what we care about, almost by definition, and care is an aspect of our being in the most fundamental sense for Heidegger. So or that, having to do with the way we connect to the world through our concerns and through our care. And these are, I've mentioned before, in German, these are all come out of the same root, and they don't in English. But so yeah, how we relate to that, it's tangled up. This is one of the interesting things, and why I referred to it in the episode that's just going to drop as the ontological goo, is that in this worldview, like in Descartes' world, everything's kind of abstracted in a clean way. Here's a subject, there's an object. The subject is gonna, perceive the subject, or the object rather, and uh, each is in its own little tidy box, you might say. But for Heidegger, the between belongs to the being of the subject, being Dasein, being a human.
Why is
That
that important? Who owns the between?
Because it says that we aren't a separate consciousness in a little box looking out at the world. We are gooed out into the world. We are the world gooed its way up into us to perceive. Like, it's just not separately thingified. And this translated across to schools of modern psychology and psychotherapy, this sort of an insight. And but so what I was going to get to was, both of them came to the significance of dialogue and of dialectic. But in the analytic pragmatic school, it shows up as science, and it shows up as debate, and it shows up as one view championed against another view, where one view is going to win out because it explains more, because it, is simpler, or, we've got our own hard rules of who wins in that world. But then in this other world, where in that first world, objectivity rules, right? But in this other world, this world where we're trying to understand interiority as a critical element of encountering and metabolizing the truth of the outer world, subjectivity is now a way that we mutually enrich each other. And instead of using it as a combative to win, in a clash of hard rules to perceive, to establish the rules of an objective material reality, instead we build a bridge to fuse horizons, to enrich in meaning a subjective but shared, in part, internal reality. And that aspect, that's the world of meaning. That's the between us and the world. That's the meaning part. That's the logos of ontological being, meaning. That's the part that we don't just bring. We swim in like a fish swims in it, so you can't really talk to a fish about water. And that's why we don't see it. That's why we miss it ontologically, according to Heidegger. So fundamental. And also we miss it because we have these scales of inauthenticity put upon us by the tyrannical they
Culture.
culture, das Man, uh, that we don't choose, that just smothers all up our natural relationship with being. And that's another
You know,
reason of that
I
path of solitude,
what would
right?
we come up with if we each, had to develop our own concept of time, you know? Like, how much is that constructed? What were you about to say about, I think the solitude? You were coming back to why we
Well,
have to
that
go into the desert or not.
yeah, because it uh, 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 frees us from that the press of culture, the whirring of the cicadas that drives us towards inauthenticity and that obstructs our relationship with capital B being. And that's why hermits have always gone away from society at large. Not that there isn't a, as we've said before, that 10th bull in the 10 bulls back in the world, that sort of after a certain progress has been made, there is a role back in the world, but that somehow some fundamental nature of the relationship has changed, has shifted. And so, um, I mean, I suppose that has to do, this plugs into a lot of the things that we've talked about as far as how one relates to the world of, to the outside world, and whether it's a theater for the expression of oneself, for bringing the inside out, or a place to hunt things on the outside to assimilate into oneself, not unlike the Borg, right? Resistance is irrelevant. And it's interesting because what's the thing about the Borg, to push that a little further, what is the Borg, what's important to the Borg? Whether it's relevant or not, right? Well, that's from that realm of the hard rules of reason and of material reality. It's not about the richness of a shared subjectivity, although they are the hive, which is by nature the expression of a shared subjectivity. Somehow they rule in this mechanistic way. So there's a kind of an interesting rub there between yeah, subjectivity and objectivity, and you
And
know,
individual versus collective, yeah.
yeah, and the organic and the inorganic, and the inorganicness of pure reason as your standard for relevance.
Who
As
wrote the
opposed
critique of pure reason?
in there somewhere. Yeah, it definitely was the foundation that a lot of modern philosophy was reacting to, what Kant thought you could and couldn't do. But see, that's another thing. Just like Descartes had subject and object, Kant had noumena and phenomena, and Heidegger wouldn't have any of that either. This is the goo that I'm referring. He melted them together like a quesadilla, like that's it, like an ontological quesadilla. Now you can't separate anything; it's all just part of the cheesy
Which is, I
universal
mean, I
goo.
guess is a is an insight when it comes to physics. I don't know if he was following that, but wasn't he writing around the time Einstein was coming up with relativity?
Who?
Heidegger.
Well, see, Heidegger was born in 1889, so he would have maybe been a little young,
Okay.
uh, for him
'Cause
to
it's a similar
really
insight,
get his
the
game
goo,
on.
to, you know, all these electrons, orbiting nuclei are mostly space, or that atoms are mostly space, and the space, so an object is made of mostly space, and the space between
Right.
objects is also mostly space, and there's not really that much difference between them, which is odd.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and when they make contact with one another, there's actually an electromagnetic field interfered with as opposed to um, actual contact, which is wild.
Yep,
So
yep.
yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a parallel between those physics insights and the goo that you're describing.
Well, and time, don't forget
And
time,
timing. Yeah.
right? And these became, like, I think, a battlefield that the idealists and the materialists were kind of fighting over. And because, for example, another person we're gonna, talk about maybe more, we've talked about a little bit, and I wanna make, I think is gonna be the next reading on our, audio bookshelf is, Henri Bergson and Creative Evolution, sitting right here just poised, and, but he had a famous debate with Albert Einstein
Oh, huh. I wonder if that's
on
on
the
YouTube
topic
someplace.
on the topic of time. And, which is another super slippery fish. And, and its relationship with velocity and gravity and the whole deal. But, so no, there, and that's why, Heidegger again, it's being in time. And so with Heidegger on that idealistic side, and this is one of the dimensions that they pushed back on. Is time the clicking of a clock, objective, or is the 1 hour that you spend um, eating your favorite meal equal to 1 hour spent in the waiting room of the dentist to get your root canal, or in a traffic jam?
Depends on your perspective. Depends on your state of mind.
A lot. Yeah. And that's their point, is that's the lived experience component. And they would say that, well, your time is going to speed up and is going to slow down. And in fact, in the internal arts, we say one of the things that we want to do is we want to have our internal speed moving with our external speed. And you have to figure out intuitively what that means. And just that koan, what speed am I moving at inside right now,
Mm,
is a useful self-reflective device. Um,
mhm.
but no, there's a whole, a whole series of things that start to look awfully similar to Eastern disciplines start to show up coming out of these phenomenologist guys. It has to do with introspection and the observation of the mechanisms of our own mind, which I think is very fruitful. And we'll get into more of that. I'm mining a bunch of that out of William James now, in the area where I'm mining out some of his thoughts about his concept of stream of consciousness or stream of thought, which was a reaction to the thinking of the psychology of the day. And some very interesting observations, that things that, like, well, I've been thinking all these years, I never noticed that. But of course that's the case. And of course well, I'll get into that at some point in the future, but of course that translates straight to the structure of written language, regardless of which
Right.
written language we're talking, things like that, where you go, "Oh, wow, new ahas about things that you do 10 times before breakfast."
Huh,
You know,
that's fun.
interesting. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, so where does that leave the ball? Are we near the green or
Yeah,
off
yeah, I
off in the
think for
rough?
now, I mean, I'm kinda walking away with, um, the let's say, the narrative that I have, or the maybe better, the hermeneutic, process that I'm in relative to what is this mountain and these paths up it is, um, slightly more filled in than it was, before this conversation.
Mhm.
Just thinking about, like, what the paths up the mountain mean, what, what some of the tensions are that we hold, especially this individual collective tension.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, uh, it's some of it still seems somewhat paradoxical to me. That's why I'm still thinking of it as a tension. But I imagine um, balance is just as good a word, or integration is just as good a word.
And it kind of becomes a topic for observation and rumination, uh, which is to say, chewing and swallowing and then bringing back up and chewing again. And, in your using your philosophical rumen. Uh, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, check out a video about how your cow works.
Or your elk. Yeah.
And the idea being that understanding might come through a process of digestion, and that there might be some cycles in that digestion. And I think one of the big takeaways, particularly from the things we've been talking about today, is that when we say "I," our immediate assumed context for that is Cartesian. I'm here, I have this name, I'm in this body, I'm motoring it around just like when my body climbs in a car, my body motors my car around, and everything else is out there, and it's just all dumb matter, and that somehow there's this great gulf that exists between my isolated me-ness and the otherness of not just the world at large, but other people. And what these philosophers, as well as, shaman and some of these other paths tell us, is that you are connected to the world in mysterious ways that are not obvious to you. And what happens and how you interact with it and how you manifest within your world and your life story is much more mysteriously interconnected than appears to you. So keep your eyes open, and don't keep looking at every squirrel that runs by. Which is to say, don't get tangled up in the small b being, which is things. Try to keep the thought about the big B being and what that story is, and, how that dimension of things is manifesting through the goo of lack of discrete separation between you and the world that manifests around you. W- What the nature of your being is being in the world, hyphenated one word, according to Heidegger, right? So that means that there is that you're you're connected in ways that it might behoove you to muse about, to riddle the reality around you. What about that? Uh, I'm a great believer that if we hold certain things in our mind as koans, a deeper mind will answer. And so this is kind of like a whole direction of ways to think about this. It recontextualizes our understanding the chapters of our lives and stuff like that. So a lot of pay dirt in there, I think. Um,
Cool.
but yeah,
Thank you, Brian.
that's what I got for you today.
Good stuff. See you soon.
Okay. Yep.